rings of power are flashing on the sea. The magic is angry.
Did you know, and this is a crazy fact because I just learned this, but did you know there's no canon in Tolkien? Really? I didn't know this until I learned it this week from the Tolkien professor himself, Dr. Corey Olsen, who showed up in an Amazon promotional video for the Rings of Power to assure fans and detractors that there really isn't, and that all this stuff, all the fast and loose ways that Amazon and the showrunners of the Rings of Power and the writers of that show have been messing up the Second Age and Tolkien's legendarium and his lore, it doesn't matter, because there is no such thing as canon in Tolkien lore. So here's what he said in this video. He said, "First thing to specify is that there's no such thing, really, as canon in Tolkien. Tolkien's ideas were ever evolving. In the text of The Lord of the Rings, we're told that Gandalf, with the other wizards, arrived at around year 1000 of the Third Age, and in his later years he was playing with the idea of maybe Gandalf coming sooner, maybe some of the wizards coming in the Second Age, and taking part in the Wars of the Rings of Power." Oh, this is curious, because there's another way that Dr. Olsen could have presented this notion that wouldn't have been nearly as controversial. Because there is such thing as canon. There just is. It's absurd beyond all reckoning to say that there is no such thing as canon in Tolkien. We can separate out... Okay, so first of all, canon is kind of the established, agreed upon lore and story and backstory and details and all that stuff that makes up what we accept is true to the fiction, right? So, for instance, we have what we would call the hard canon agreed upon by everyone of Tolkien's work, which is simply The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Everything published in those books is canon, right? Everything published posthumously by his son Christopher Tolkien would be considered more of a soft canon. And I think there's actually degrees of this, and it may not be that important to get into that. But I would say the Silmarillion is sort of bridging the gap between hard canon and then kind of all the unfinished tales and history of Middle-earth and all that other stuff. Because the Silmarillion was more complete and more finished than a lot of his other notes and letters and things like that, which make up more of, I wouldn't even call it canon so much as like Tolkien's musings, and often contradictory ideas of what may have happened. Because, authors, not just Tolkien, I mean, though he was certainly extensive in it, but many authors make lots of notes and jot down ideas, and it doesn't all make it into a finished work. You can't really say that because Tolkien was playing around with the idea of the wizards coming to Middle-earth in the Second Age, that somehow supersedes what was published in The Lord of the Rings. To add to this, Amazon only bought the rights to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and its appendices. They did not buy the rights to Tolkien's other work, like the Silmarillion. They did not buy the rights or have rights to any of his notes, anything like that. So they have to go off of what was purchased from the Tolkien estate, and that was simply the hard canon stuff, right? Now, I'll read another quote here. This is explaining what was purchased, right? So this kind of fleshes out what the showrunners were thinking, based on what Amazon purchased for them to fuck up. "We have the rights solely to the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, the Return of the King, the Appendices, and the Hobbit," showrunner J.D. Payne said. "And that is it. We do not have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, or any of those other books."
"There's a version of everything we need for the Second Age in the books we have the rights to," co-showrunner Patrick McKay added. "As long as we're painting within those lines and not egregiously contradicting something we don't have the rights to, there's a lot of leeway and room to dramatize and tell some of the best stories that Tolkien ever came up with.
Or, conversely, tell a bunch of stories Tolkien never came up with. Or, worse, take the stories that Tolkien did come up with, get them all out of order, compress the timeline, and see what happens. I want to say before we go further that I really am not against breaking canon. Like, I think you have to in an adaptation to some degree, especially something like The Second Age, which is a lot looser narratively than The Lord of the Rings, which is told, you know, in a very different style within the Silmarillion and in, you know, what they're using from appendices and stories within The Lord of the Rings of The Second Age. Obviously, you are going to have to make some changes. I think most people would agree with this. I think that, like, fundamentally saying there is no canon is so much more deceptive and manipulative than just saying, hey, we're going to take dramatic license, we're going to break some canon in service of adapting this into a narrative television series. Like, if I were to do something like that, I don't think I would even want to tell these stories from the Silmarillion necessarily, or from the Second Age. I mean, it could be cool to show the fall of Numenor. There is a version of the Rings of Power that shows the forging of the rings and then the sacking of Eregion that makes sense. In a lot of ways, I feel like those should be two different shows completely. Not maybe, you know, maybe different seasons, but certainly different story arcs set in different times. I think it would just be more cool to take the tapestry of Middle-earth and its history and tell new stories inside that. I mentioned on Twitter, you know, you could have a whole, like, Seven Samurai style story with the Dunedain, and you could do all kinds of things where you make up some new characters, you have it set in Middle Earth, you write a good script with a compelling story that doesn't really mess with any of the bigger broad stroke stuff, that doesn't change the timeline or compress it, but tells a smaller story within it that's not something Tolkien wrote, but that's set in his world and that's faithful to the spirit and ideas and values of his world and his fiction. That I think I could see. But when it comes to adaptations, we do have Tolkien himself, who wrote in Letter 210 some thoughts on a script that was proposed for an adaptation of Lord of the Rings back in 1958. So here's some snippets from that letter. And he's talking here about, you know, adapters. not like that you plug in, but like people who are adapting scripts, specifically his books into a script. I would ask them to make an effort of imagination sufficient to understand the irritation and, on occasion, the resentment of an author who finds, increasingly as he proceeds, his work treated as it would seem carelessly in general, in places recklessly, and with no evident signs of any appreciation of what it is all about. Now, if that doesn't describe the Rings of Power, nothing does. Carelessly, recklessly, and with no evident signs of any appreciation of what it is all about. The canons of narrative in any medium cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration and in the intrusion of an unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies. Again, you could use this in a review of the Rings of Power. Exaggeration and the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies. That to a T describes problems with the Rings of Power. And there are so many others, of course. There's a lot more in this letter. He talks about, you know, how battle scenes have taken over character moments and just the description in the script of, like, Lothlorien looking nothing like how it was he would see it. He even has a passage where he says, "Why on earth should Z," the scripts writer, "say that the hobbits, quote, were munching ridiculously long sandwiches? Ridiculous indeed. I do not see how any author could be expected to be pleased by such silly alterations. One hobbit was sleeping, the other smoking." Now you can see where Tolkien is very, very, very concerned with small details. Because in the big scheme of things, what does it matter if the hobbits are munching on sandwiches or smoking and sleeping? But for Tolkien, it does. And of course, Tolkien, in many other writings, has talked about how important time and distance and the geography and the history are all in his work, because he's meticulous about this stuff. Another passage from this letter. "The many impossibilities and absurdities which further hurrying produces might, I suppose, be unobserved by an uncritical viewer, but I do not see why they should be unnecessarily introduced. Time must naturally be left vaguer in a picture than in a book, but I cannot see why definite time statements, contrary to the book and to probability, should be made." Now, this again could describe very easily the compressed timeline of the Second Age and the fast travel across Middle-earth, for instance, from Numenor to Middle-earth in the first season. But all throughout this series, Similar to later seasons of Game of Thrones, we've seen fast travel. And then in this series, of course, major time compression that really, really screws up what's supposed to be a several thousand year time span has been compressed down into one TV show that could have still had, time jumps to get us through these stories. But now we have Numenor falling at the same time the rings are being made. At this point, Numenor seems about to fall before the One Ring has even been crafted. So I think Tolkien might be a little bit upset by that if he were alive to see this monstrosity in all its fetid glory. So Corey Olsen, I'm not very familiar with him. I've had him brought up by fans of The Rings of Power to sort of be used as evidence that I'm wrong. And I'm no Tolkien professor, but then again, I also didn't sell my soul to Amazon. That I think might be the real distinguishing difference between me and him. I'm not showing up in Amazon promotional videos talking about how there is no such thing as canon for Tolkien. And that is an actually absurd statement. It's the kind of statement you don't make because of a love for Tolkien's work, but because you have a financial incentive to make it. And that's what's so disturbing to me about this. That there are people in positions of authority, or not authority, but intellectual authority, people who have influence on the conversation, who are making such egregious statements to justify the existence of what can only be described not as fan fiction even, but as a work almost designed to undermine and exploit Tolkien's fiction rather than to increase its reach or tell new stories within its world. And I find that kind of evil, honestly. Ultimately, I think we've seen a lot of discussion on YouTube, especially about how this show is woke or how all this wokeness is ruining shows. But I think wokeness is just a cover. Like all this social justice stuff that we see is just used almost as a marketing tool and also as a defensive armor against criticism. Because these companies like Amazon don't care about social justice. They don't care about minorities or women. They just want to make money. And so they fly that flag of social justice and they put all the DEI stuff in there because they know that what the conversation is going to turn to is that kind of stuff. And then they can say, haha, bigots. Bigots are the problem. Toxic dude bros. And they can rely on members of Access Media to back them. Because, journalism is deeply, deeply, deeply obsessed with social justice and wokeness. So when we see those lines of critique coming from YouTube or from certain right-wing blogs, it's just so easy to deflect because people can just say, oh, they're just racist, they're just sexist. And I mean, I get this all the time where my critiques are written off as I was just on Twitter and someone was mad at my Walking Dead Daryl Dixon review because apparently I hate all shows with women in them because I don't like Carol from The Walking Dead, which is crazy, but this is kind of where we're at. And I expect that kind of thing from Twitter idiots, but it's kind of disappointing. It's massively disappointing when you see something far, far worse said from someone who ought to know better. Because there just is, this isn't even in dispute. Whatever Tolkien said in some notes that were tossed into a publication years after his death, that does not outweigh what was written in his published works while he was alive. And there is no debate about that. There's none. The problem with Rings of Power isn't that it goes off script. It isn't that they're telling new stories within Middle-earth. It's that it's literally contradicting those stories and the timelines. Which, with Patrick McKay's statement, where he says, as long as... It's so funny. As long as we're painting within those lines and not egregiously contradicting something that we don't have the rights to, there's a lot of leeway and room to dramatize. But they are egregiously contradicting. And this is, and people will say the other appeal to authority. Well, the Tolkien estate is on board. Yeah, well, Simon Tolkien isn't, he's certainly not J.R.R. Tolkien. He's not even Christopher Tolkien. I place no more value over Simon Tolkien's opinions than I would do any other person on this planet. You don't get special, holy rights to something just because you are in charge of the estate. Ideally, you will be a good steward of that estate. Ideally. But just like, I'm sorry, just like I don't believe that power should be handed down from father to son in an outdated monarchical system, I don't believe that being Simon Tolkien grants you anything other than legal rights over what's done with Tolkien's work. It certainly doesn't mean that what you do with that work is good and right and respectful of what his grandfather wrote. And it's sad. It is sad. That's really sad to me that people who love these books but have no, biological attachment to the author seem to have more regard for them than the estate does. Because if I were in his shoes, I would not have sold Amazon the rights and given them this blank check. At least Christopher Tolkien had standards. And he had some criticisms of the movies. I certainly have criticisms of the Peter Jackson movies. But looking at those now, years later, after so many other adaptations have been made of fantasy works and other beloved IP, for lack of a better word, you can really see how Jackson and his team did care about fidelity. And even though they made changes, you can understand why a lot of those changes were made, even if I do still disagree with some of them. That's another funny line of criticism, like, oh, you're just a movie fanboy and blah, 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 blah. They made changes too. Like, okay, I'm actually not. I think the movies are good, but the books are better. The books are better. So, this was mostly just a wag my finger type video. Wagging my finger at people who should know better, using their position of authority or knowledge. They're using their perch within the community to basically white knight Amazon and this monstrosity that they've created, the Rings of Power. I did also want to point out that a bunch of the writers on this show have been booted. All but like 2 are gone for season 3. And I don't know if this is significant in a good way. First of all, I don't know that they can actually repair the damage that's been done, even if they brought on the best writers ever. And without a change in leadership, as in the showrunners themselves, I don't see how we will at all fix the problems with this show in season 3. I do think there will be 5 seasons of this show. A lot of people are like, oh, it's going to get canceled. I think that from simply a perspective of pride, there's no way Amazon actually admits defeat here. I think there are also still too many people watching, and they've already bought the rights. Like, they have too much to lose. So we're going to get 3, 4, 5, or at least 3 and 4. And I think what I've heard is that it's going to be more focused on the fall of Numenor. And since they've already botched that plot so badly, and Numenor is so unbearable to watch, like, in every way, all its characters, the pettiness of the Numenorians, I just don't see how you tell the story of the fall of this mighty civilization when the civilization is presented as petty and small to begin with. You have to have a starting point, and they've just jumped. Somehow this show keeps jumping way ahead of itself, even though they have all this rich material to work with. So, season 3 will happen. We'll be back for more. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Peace.
Mountains echo story, whispers through the trees. Middle Earth is calling, feel the magic breeze.